Thank you for joining us. My name is Rachel Factor, and we're going to be talking about survey design, cultural and linguistic considerations. All right, let me just move my video here. Okay. So like I said, my name is Rachel Factor, and I am the Senior Program and Data Specialist with the Central Texas Office for Refugees. We are a part of Refugee Services of Texas, and we are a nonprofit organization located in Austin, Texas, in the United States. And we provide funding to 5 different agencies in the Austin and San Antonio areas in Texas who provide refugee resettlement services. And I am joined by Lauren Hargraves, who is our program specialist, and she will also be available to kind of keep an eye on the chat box in case anyone has any questions. And I would love to hear from you if you wouldn't mind introducing yourself in the chat box. I'd love to know, what country you're in and what kind of survey experience you have or what you do at your positions. And as you do that, I'm just going to move the presentation forward, but I'll be seeing your chats pop up on my screen. So today's presentation is going to be about 40 minutes. And during this time, I'm going to give you a basic overview of the survey design process, which includes question design and question format. So these two things are very intermeshed, as well as a quick look at the mode of SMS or text message based survey design. So of course, peppered throughout this, I'll be talking about cultural, linguistic considerations, and even experiential differences that we might see in our communities that we serve. We're going to take a 5-minute break. And after that, we're going to go into breakout sessions, or depending on how many people are in the session, we might just discuss as a group. So right now, as Yelena mentioned, your mic is muted, so please keep it muted for now. But once we do the breakout, you can turn your camera on if it's not already on, and turn your mic on as well, so we can chat. After that, we're going to reconvene as the larger group and do a report out. So you'll talk about the things that you discussed during that session. And then we'll wrap it up with any questions that I haven't had a chance to respond to. And I would also love to hear about your own experiences in survey design and survey administration. So getting started with the survey process. As I mentioned, it's going to be a 40-minute presentation, so it's going to be difficult to cover every part of the survey process. So we're going to focus today on these 3 things. So we're going to focus on goal setting, which is defining the goals of your survey. This is incredibly important. You have to have a focus for your survey. You need to know what kinds of questions you want answered, whether you have research questions or evaluation questions for programs that you're doing. It's important to have those solidified. It's also good to understand how you want to disaggregate the data. So if you want to be comparing different groups, if you serve people from different nationalities, from different language groups, or if you're surveying staff, different staff roles, supervisors versus caseworkers. So it's important to set those goals before you start your question design. So in the question design process, this is where you're asking, how are you actually going to be asking those questions? So what are the words that you are choosing? How are you ordering the questions? Question order can matter if you're asking sensitive information, for example. And then what is the question format? And so I'm going to show you some different question formats. There's so many formats that you could choose. And each choice that you make along this process can really have an effect on how people answer the questions on your survey. Survey mode, as I mentioned, is very intertwined with question design. So if you're conducting a telephone survey or an SMS survey, or if you're doing it on paper and pen, it's really going to affect the way that you might ask the questions, the words that you choose, and the question format as well. And as I said, we'll be focusing on SMS today. So once you have set your goals, you've created some questions, and you've decided upon the mode that you want to use, it's really important to conduct a pilot test. And what a pilot test is a test run of your survey. So you have the basic design, but you need to test it out on your population. And so the reason we do this is for validation. We want to make sure that our surveys are valid, which means that they have content that reflects the outcomes that you want to measure. So if you're asking a survey about program satisfaction, you want to make sure that the questions you're asking reflect program satisfaction. So you don't need to ask irrelevant questions on that. Another part of the validation process is the response process. So this is really important in the response analysis after your pilot test. So are your respondents interpreting the questions in the manner that you intended? Or are they interpreting it in a different manner? Are they influenced at all by your question format or by the question mode? As I mentioned, all of these choices that you make can influence the results. So this pilot test is a part of validation research. And validation research is going to look at all of those different ways where error can be introduced into your survey. So we want to limit error as much as possible. Now, some surveys may be already validated. So if you're choosing a survey or an assessment instrument from a larger organization, they may have validated their survey. However, it's important to look at the population on which the survey was validated. Oftentimes, surveys are validated on a population of convenience. And what that means is that they might be white, college-educated males who were able to take the survey and test it out. So if your community or your population that you're surveying does not look like this population, you need to take a closer look at that survey and make sure that it meets your needs. So as you're designing the survey, it's always important to remember that you yourself are coming from a position of your own culture. You have your own language or languages. You have your own experience in life and trauma, or perhaps not experiencing trauma in your life. Literacy and education, whether you can read, whether you understand written numbers, and then digital literacy as well, which is your comfort level with technology. So all of these things you need to be aware of, because if you do not come from the population that you're serving, you may have all of these different experiences. So as you design your survey, it's really important to check your bias. We don't want to bring that into our survey design. So I'm going to get started with question design. And in this section, I'm going to be talking about some basic do's and don'ts of survey design. We'll be discussing, a little bit about why it's even more important if you're working with vulnerable populations or populations that may be pre-literate, that don't know how to read, or lower education, digital literacy, et cetera. So feel free to ask questions in the chat box. Lauren will let me know if there's a question that comes up that's urgent. Otherwise, I'll take a pause at our next section. So of course, the do's of survey design, it's pretty obvious. We want to make sure that we're being clear and concise. It's really important that your questions are not overcomplicated, that you know what you're asking, and you have a reason why you're asking it. You also want to make sure that your questions are relevant. It's very tempting as a researcher or a program administrator to throw in extra questions that you might want to use at a later time, but you don't have a specific reason why you're asking them in this particular survey. So try not to do that as much as possible. Make sure that everything is very relevant to those survey goals that you decided upon at the beginning of your survey design. And of course, it should be comprehensive. So don't be afraid to ask the questions that you need to ask, especially when it comes to subgroups, if you are doing any comparison of subgroups. You may also have access to administrative data which you can match. So only ask questions that you do not have access to already. So our first don't that I'm going to talk about is called a double-barreled question. And a double-barreled question means that you're really asking two questions at the same time. So that's where the double-barreled comes from. So in this customer service satisfaction survey example that I found, they are asking a double-barreled question. And what that means is they're asking two things at the same time. So you'll notice here that they're asking about communication and follow-up on problem resolution. So in this case, they're asking two things: communication, which perhaps I was dissatisfied with the communication. Maybe the customer service agent was rude and I didn't like them. But the follow-up was satisfactory and I received the help that I needed in a timely manner. So if I have those different feelings about those two different things, it's going to be difficult for me to answer this question. I can't choose satisfied or dissatisfied because it doesn't fit with my true response. So we want to avoid that and make sure it's clear and concise. The next don't is a leading or a loaded question. A leading or loaded question can lead the respondent into thinking that the survey researcher wants them to respond in a particular manner. A loaded question is making a presumption that you already have a response ready. So in this example, this is an actual example of a political survey from a United States politician. Leading and loaded questions are very common in political surveys. So in this question, they're asking which do they identify as, and they can only choose American or Democrat. So by choosing one, you are denying the other. And so this is a pretty loaded question. Now in other examples that may be less loaded, if you're asking how satisfied are you with the program, for example, even that is a little bit leading. So it's important to ask questions in a very neutral manner. So you might say, how satisfied or dissatisfied are you with the program? This way you are telling your respondent that it's okay to be satisfied or dissatisfied, and we do not expect satisfaction. Complicated questions, this is pretty obvious, especially if your participants do not speak English or whatever language is the language of your survey. If they don't speak that as their first language, in this example, there's just way too many words. There are many commas here. It's a very confusing and long question. Even part of their response stem is confusing and long. So really keep it concise, keep it clear. Now, something that we may be guilty of in survey development coming from an organization administration is using jargon, which is specific words that you use that are only specific to your field that someone who's outside of your field may not understand, or just inappropriate wording that your respondents may not be familiar with. So in this example, this is actually a refugee resettlement survey given by one of our national agencies. And they were trying to ask about how the participant felt about the services that they were provided. And so in this instance, as a person who's worked in refugee resettlement for a long time, I am very familiar with the words cultural orientation and the words case management and what that means in the context of the program. They are very specific. There are specific policies surrounding them. So I know what I'm talking about. But if I'm a participant who went to a cultural orientation, I may not know that it was called cultural orientation. It may have been a class, it may have been a one-on-one session with their case manager. So just make sure that you're really specifying what these things mean, or preparing your recipients before they take the survey about the words that you're going to be using and the terms that you're using. The other term on here that I don't like so much is the word affiliate. And this is, again, this is kind of a jargony word. It's the word that we use to refer to our agencies or our organizations that provide services, but it's not even that common of a word, I think, in English. So I would possibly change that to be either the name of the organization or to say organization or agency, something a little bit more common. So another big don't is being exclusionary or showing that bias that I discussed before in your survey. So I'm sure many of you are working with vulnerable populations, with people from all different backgrounds. And so it's important that you look at the survey from their point of view. This is their survey. So things like gender and sexual orientation, these are a spectrum. And so the way that we present the options to them can make someone feel excluded if we don't have an option that is for them. So gender, male, female, if you even put other, sometimes that can make someone feel not so included in the survey. Same with sexual orientation. There is a spectrum. There are many different options that you may want to include. The most important thing is to know your population and know what might be necessary. For race and ethnicity, again, it's important to know your population and what are the terms that you might want to use, what different categories you're going to be including if you do need to ask this question. So there's a great cartoon here by an artist named Mona Chalabi. And so in this cartoon, she's showing at the top here a government survey where in the US specifically, we often see white, Black, Hispanic, and Asian. And so here she is at the bottom, an Arab woman, and she doesn't feel that she belongs in any of these categories. So this survey is exclusionary. So she may feel uncomfortable giving that information. And in the US, we often expect Arabs to select the white option. And that's really, it's not good for her, feeling excluded, feeling like she needs to select something that doesn't represent her. But it's also really bad for your data. What you're doing there is amplifying the white voice in the survey, even though she does not represent the white voice. So it's important to include the appropriate categories. Geographic location can even show some of your bias and can be exclusionary. So if you're working with indigenous populations, for example, you don't have to feel like you're obligated to use state and national geographic lines. You may want to look at that population and see how do they define their regions and their spaces. So some of these survey questions that I found as examples came from this really great Twitter account called Bad Survey Question. And you can check it out if you can take a look at Twitter sometime and see some really bad survey questions or just strange survey questions. So I recommend that. And I will also be providing a link to some resources that provide more information about bad survey questions and good survey questions. So I'll take a quick pause there before we get into question format. And just make sure there's no questions in the chat box. So thank you for everyone for introducing yourself. Oh, great, there's even a Texan on here, that's awesome. Excellent, okay. I don't think I saw any questions in there, so I'm just gonna keep on going. So we're gonna talk about question format. Now, in question format in this section, we're going to talk about the different ways that you may be asking the question, the way that it may look on your SMS, the way that it may look on a pen and paper. So these are considerations for you. There we go. So if you are familiar with survey design, you may have seen scales that look like this. This is taken from one of the examples from above. These are called Likert scales. They're measuring attitude towards something, or other types of scales may be mixed in here as well. So you'll see that in these Likert scales, we're essentially asking the same question, but they're asking it in a very different manner. So in this top one, we're seeing on the left, it says very satisfied, and on the right, it says very dissatisfied. Now, if you look down to these next two, the left is actually completely dissatisfied, where the right side is the completely satisfied. So this can make a difference if you're working with populations, again, who don't speak your language as the first language. And if they come from a language background where their language is written from right to left or from left to right. So English, of course, is written from left to right. Languages like Arabic, Urdu, Hebrew, these are written from right to left. So their orientation to your survey may be influenced by the way that you write this. You know, people are often known for not reading the directions. And so if I have an assumption about where I think the satisfied point should be, that might influence the way that I take the survey, and I might take it incorrectly, or I might be confused by it. In the second one, they have numbers as well as words, so that can influence the way that we take the survey. And then on this one, this is really specific to an online survey that you would have to slide this button here to show how satisfied or dissatisfied you are. And there's no midpoints, you'll notice. There's only the end points. Excuse me. So all of this can really influence the way that people take questions. Now, in my work, we did an SMS-based survey with Swahili and Arabic-speaking refugees. And we had done an experiment where we gave them cell phones, and our cell phone provider wanted to ask them this classic question about, on a scale of 1 to 10, this is a rough translation of what it says up here in Swahili, on a scale of 1 to 10, with 10 being the highest, how likely are you to recommend this service to a friend? Send a number between 1 and 10. Now, again, for us attending this conference, you know, you're probably familiar with this type of scale, you're familiar with surveys, but it's important to note that this scale of 1 to 10, this kind of question, it's really not universal. If someone has never taken a survey, if they've never seen this type of question, this may be confusing. So in this example, you'll notice that as we asked this question, our respondent really struggled with understanding what we were asking them. And so they started off by listing off all of the numbers. They then wrote their phone number. And then finally, they ended with the numbers listed out again between 1 and 10. And in this case, the way that our SMS coding system worked, it actually recognized this response as a 1. Now, imagine if this person was taking a paper survey and they didn't understand the question, but they decided to circle number 1. Would that be an accurate reflection of their true response? And the answer is, of course, no. But I wouldn't know that if I didn't pilot out this survey and I didn't see how they were thinking about this survey. And so in this case, this type of question really didn't seem to work for many of our Swahili-speaking respondents. So one question format that you may want to try, especially if you're working with people who don't speak your language, or if they are not literate, if they're pre-literate, you might want to try images and symbols. It's a great way to add a visual element, keep it interesting, try to keep it relevant to your population. But it's really important to note that symbols and icons are also not universal. It's informed by your experience, by your life experience, where you grew up. It's also informed by your education. So things that you've seen, if you're able to read, if you're able to interpret the context. So, so in this example, again, this comes from the Refugee Resettlement Survey. They were doing a pen and paper survey, and they were asking people to answer the questions using these smiley faces. So again, coming from my personal background, growing up in the US, I understand exactly what this is getting at. I know that this big frowny face is, you know, very dissatisfied or very unhappy, and this one is maybe just a little bit unhappy. But if you look at the size of the smiley faces, you know, there's really very little distinction between them. And if I wasn't familiar with what this question is getting at, it may be more difficult for me to really discern what the nuance is here. It may be also difficult for them to associate this checkbox with the smiley face. If they are pre-literate or low literacy levels, all of this is a lot to take in, and it would be better to simplify it for them. Now, as an example of why symbols and icons are not universal, or how we know this. There was a study that was conducted, I believe it was at the University of Minnesota, with Somali refugee women. And they were asked to look at some images and icons that were trying to represent common ideas. And so in this example, number 1 is looking at a text bubble. So this woman is supposed to be saying something. And in number 4, it's looking at a thought bubble. So this is representing the idea of thinking. So for us, again, pretty common. We see this a lot in cartoons and other images that we see in our life. But for the Somali refugee women who in this particular group were pre-literate or very low literacy, there were a lot of different explanations for this. So in some notable responses, number 1, one woman said that it maybe looked like a hammer next to this woman. And number 4, someone noted that maybe it was a rain cloud. Okay, so just make sure that if you do use images and symbols in your surveys, that you make sure that these are recognizable to your population. So another point that you may want to consider when you are building your question formats is that people have a tendency to either respond in the extreme, which would be on the very high point and the very low point of the scale, or they may have a tendency to respond in the midpoint, which is maybe the neutral or the agree or disagree, somewhere in the middle. And what research has found is that this may correlate with culture. And so you may see individual differences, but as a whole, sometimes cultures have an extreme response behavior or a midpoint response behavior. And so this can correlate with acquiescence bias, which means social desirability, meaning they have more of a tendency to agree with the survey rather than disagree. This can correlate with expression of emotion. Some cultures may be more prone to expressing extreme emotions and may be more comfortable with that, and other cultures may be less comfortable expressing those extremes. This can correlate with gender roles of 2, of course. Men or women may be less prone to extreme response or midpoint response. And language choice too can, of course, make a difference. So if you're using words such as extremely agree or extremely satisfied versus completely or very, this can influence the way that your respondents interpret your question and respond accordingly. So in a marketing research, there's a marketing firm called B2B Marketing. They looked at the response tendencies of people from many different countries. And what this chart is showing you is the level of acquiescence starting from low to high. So meaning were they more likely to use the positive point of the scale. Down here is the extreme response or the midpoint. So meaning were they more likely to use the very satisfied versus very dissatisfied. And so you'll notice here that it really did differ when you looked at the countries as a whole. So for example, way up here is a couple Hispanic countries. Well, I think this is Brazil and Mexico. So South and Central American countries. They had more of a tendency to be positive and to express in the extreme. And of course, when I say extreme, I just mean the highest point of the scale. But if you look at some of the Asian countries represented, for example, in their study, they looked at Singapore and I believe South Korea. They also showed a bit of more of a positive trend in their responses, but they really did not like to answer in the extremes. So the danger here when you're giving a survey to people of many different cultures is the tendency to look at the Central American and South American responses as these people must be more happy than the Asian cultures, when that may not be the case. It may just be the case that the cultures have a different way of responding. So again, in my work in Refugee Mobile, we conducted an in-person survey at the end of our study. And again, we're working with Arabic and Swahili speakers. And the Arabic speakers had slightly more even distribution of responses on the scale. So this side of the scale is the highest point of the scale, and this side is the lowest point of the scale. And you'll notice that our Swahili speakers tended to have less of a distribution. They tended to maybe answer a little bit higher and didn't use the midpoint quite as much. So if we look at that as an aggregate, if we look at that as a whole, with the extreme responses and the midpoint responses, you can really start to see that there is a difference in the number of midpoints used compared to our Swahili speakers. And this was statistically significant, so that's what this is notating here on a chi-square distribution. That just means that these two distributions were statistically different. So you may wonder, how do I correct for this? The first thing is important to know, when might it exist? So you're going to know that by conducting that pilot test, see how they're responding, look at those response patterns, study your population, know your population, have conversations with people, look at cultural backgrounds, and you may have a bit of an idea of whether extreme or midpoint bias may exist. So if you've already conducted the survey, the second point here is something you could do, which is aggregate the responses on either side of the scale. So instead of looking at strongly agree and agree as separate points in the scale, you would put them together as the agree side, and similar for the disagree side. However, that is going to take out some of that nuance that you put into your scale. There was a reason you chose to do a scale as opposed to a yes or no, right? We want that nuance. We want to know if they were very satisfied or just a little bit satisfied. So the second thing you can do, if you run your pilot test and you see, there's some extreme or midpoint bias going on, you can split your question into two parts. And this came from an experiment from a consulting firm here in the US, where they were looking at Hispanic, Spanish-speaking Americans and their tendency to respond in the extreme. And so they wanted to get more nuance from them. So what they did is they first started with a yes or no question. So for example, were you satisfied with the program? Yes or no? So they would choose one or the other. And after they did that, a second question would come up and they would ask, to what degree? So they were asked, if they said yes, were you very satisfied or were you a little satisfied, for example? So this is a really interesting way that you might want to get more nuance out of a survey if your populations have a tendency towards the extreme. So I will do a quick pause there. See, I don't think I see any chat questions. Okay, we will continue with mode. So as I mentioned, we're focusing on SMS today, or text message-based surveys. And so we did conduct a couple different SMS surveys in our work during the Refugee Mobile Project. And so you'll see we translated into Arabic here. This is our English version and our Swahili version here. So SMS is I think it was a really great mode to use. So here's a couple thoughts from my project about the pros and the cons of using SMS. So one major reason that we chose to use SMS is because it's usable without an internet connection and without data. So if your populations may or may not have a smartphone, if they have limited data, if they don't have Wi-Fi at home, which was the case for a lot of our respondents, you can use SMS because really anyone with a cell phone can receive an SMS message. It's very inexpensive, which is important to us as a smaller nonprofit. And it was pretty easy to set up. We used a program called textit.in. They are very user-friendly, and it doesn't take too much knowledge of programming or anything like that to set it up. So that's great. It also has really great features within it to do reminders to your participants if they forgot to answer a question. It can set up automatic reminders. It has date features. So if there's a specific event, you can ask them a question that starts 2 weeks after that event happens. It's also flexible response timing. And this can be really important for people who are working. Sometimes our clients here in Texas and around the US, they're often working second shift or third shift positions, which means they work in the late afternoon to the evening or even at night. So it can be hard for a staff member to contact them in person or just speaking to them on the phone. So it's really important that they have flexibility in their response timing. The cons that we found, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about those in the next slides, but we found, with SMS, they're able to respond in free form. So that means that they can type whatever they want to in that message. They're not limited to checking boxes, for example. There's a character limit, which makes it difficult, to ask long questions or to really explain your questions. And to give them the response options. Sometimes the message gets cut up into different messages. So we've had some challenges with that. Their ability to respond is also going to depend on their digital literacy. So their comfort with technology, their numeracy, if they're comfortable with the Roman alphabet numbers, if they understand that. And general literacy, so are they able to read? If they're not able to read, doing an SMS may not be the best option. Language setup, I'm going to talk about, that was a bit of a challenge. And then you might have an uncertainty in who's actually responding. So you send an SMS out, you don't hear a voice, you don't see a person, so you don't actually know who responds. And in our case, we work with families who are often sharing a cell phone. So I don't really know if it was the person that I intended or maybe if it was his daughter. So I'm not sure about that. The other thing you may want to double check is whether you have permission to send SMS. Depending on your country, there may be rules and laws about who can send mass amounts of text or text messages unsolicited. So it's important to get permission from your respondents before you send messages if possible. So when it comes to free-form response, again, this is something that we saw in our survey. This is a survey that we did after 6 months of their arrival to the US. And we wanted to know, in general, how do they describe their life in the United States? And we wanted them to answer good, average, or bad. Now, this is not the greatest survey question, but that is how we decided to do it. And as you'll see with this response, this Swahili speaker did not use these categories. They preferred to answer in more of a free form. They wanted to explain. And so it's a really interesting and rich response, but it didn't fit into this category that I had chosen. So it's hard for me to analyze within this context. But again, very interesting, may make me think again about how I ask this question. So what we found with the SMS responses is that we found that it was probably correlated with digital literacy. And again, digital literacy is the ability to use technology, comfort with technology. So you'll note that we had 56.7% response rate with our Swahili speakers and 87.4% with our Arabic speakers. Now, we knew from a previous assessment what their general digital literacy was. And so we had surveyed 24 of the Swahili speakers and 77 of the Arabic speakers. And in that survey, we found that their previous smartphone ownership was about 59%, comfort with Wi-Fi and apps are all hovering around that 50%, which really correlates to this number here. And similar with Arabic, they reported a bit more comfort using technology, and we see that with their response rate as well. So if your population has a lower digital literacy, if they have lower comfort with technology, they may need more support with SMS, or you may need to choose a different type of mode. So language was also difficult to navigate. Now, I don't speak Arabic or Swahili, so we use translators to help us with this. But what happens with the coding of the responses is that people will use various spellings. They're not using a formal response. It's a casual texting context. So the responses might not be spelled correctly just because they're being casual, or perhaps they don't know how to spell it if they have a lower literacy or education level. And then we found, particularly with Arabic and Spanish, there are accents and diacritical marks that are difficult to account for. And I'll show you a couple examples. And then use emojis. If your population uses emojis, make sure that you account for those and make sure that you understand what they're doing. If they're giving you a thumbs up or a smiley face, you may interpret that as a yes. If they're giving you anything else, you may want to double check what that means to them. So here's a couple examples of the language that we struggled with. So with the coding, so this is what the coding looks like in TextIt, where we tell TextIt if it sees any of these words to tell me that that means yes. So you'll see in English, we have a couple different options, and this is the Swahili translation. So you'll note in Swahili, the word for yes is ndio, but there were multiple spellings of that word. So again, different literacy rates, different education. Swahili is a recently written language, so there aren't necessarily agreed upon ways of spelling a word. So we had to account for several different yeses and several different nos. Similar in Arabic, we saw, there's so many different marks in Arabic, either the vowels or the diacritical marks. So we had to do a lot of different iterations of those words to make sure that our survey tool captured those responses the way that we wanted them to. So in conclusion, my tips to you are to know your audience. Like I said, do that pilot survey, research your population, see if there's any research out there about their response behaviors, talk to them. Make sure that your target audience is participating in the survey process. So if you or a member of your staff is not already a part of that population, you would want to make sure that you're conducting that pilot. You can conduct cognitive interviews, which are kind of like focus groups, where you ask the respondents to let them know their thought process about what the question means to them and how they might respond. So I do have a link to more information about that on my resource list. For vulnerable populations, it's important to establish trust as well. If they're less familiar with surveys, if they come from a population, for us, for refugees, a lot of times, big organizations or government entities, they may be mistrustful because of their refugee background. So support them as much as you can. Let them know why you're asking survey questions, what you're going to use it for. And you may need to remind them about it if they're not as familiar with how surveys work. So we're going to take a break. And before we do that, let me just let you know about our breakout groups. So when we come back, so we have some, I don't know how many participants we have. So we may go out into 2 separate breakout groups, or we may just do one big group, but I would love to hear from you all. So this is your chance to unmute your mic. I've got a Google Doc that I will link in the chat. And we're going to talk about some survey questions. You'll have an opportunity to kind of create your own and tell me more about your experiences. So we'll take a break, 5 minutes or so, and then we will come back and do breakout groups. So yeah, so there's 6 participants, so I think we will probably do it all together. So just take a quick break and then come on back. So at this time, feel free to turn your video on if you would like, and you can unmute yourself since we're going to start off with some introductions. Okay, there we go. So I've dropped in the chat box a link to a PDF for some resources that you may find interesting. Okay. Okay, so I'm just gonna share the screen as well with the breakout session. So let's go ahead and get started with introductions. So please, let me know your name, title, organization, and what country you're calling from, as well as any experience that you have conducting or analyzing surveys, or what countries you operate in. Or if you don't have experience, what kinds of questions do you have today? So If someone wants to get started, please feel free. Otherwise, I will try to call on someone. So I'll just go ahead. Oh, yes, was that somebody?
Hi, I can start. It's Colin speaking. So yeah, I'm Colin Garcia from CartONG. I'm a MDC and I am assistant also at CartONG. I have a small experience in survey because I actually started working in June. So I just finished my studies. The small, I guess, experience I have in analyzing survey is during a research internship. So it was really, it's called Enquête permanente agricole. So it's an agricultural survey from Burkina Faso.
Oh, great.
That's pretty much it. Thanks.
Awesome. Thank you for joining.
Yep.
Okay. Okay. Anyone else?
Hello, I can introduce myself as well.
Yes, go ahead.
I'm Faye Candiari, based in The Hague. I'm with Activity Info, which is an information management software that is used for data collection and analysis. And I'm usually working on writing material and articles and tips on how you can improve your data collection processes or your information management processes. So this is very interesting for me, as I can see new tips and ideas and from the experts. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Okay. Who'd like to go next?
Hi, I'm Florian. I'm working for Humanity and Inclusion. I'm based in France. I'm the manager of our IM division. So currently I'm not really conducting surveys myself, but I'm supervising people doing that in about 50 countries, so a lot of different cultural contexts. So obviously I don't know precisely all of the different contexts, but it's very interesting to get this kind of presentation. And in the past, I've been working in Morocco, so I was really closer to the field, even if I was not myself conducting the surveys because of language questions, obviously. And just one point that was very interesting in relation to that was that in Morocco, there is a very big difference between the written and the oral language. And so it was something that had to be taken into account in this context.
Yeah. Great, thank you. Okay, I think we have a couple more.
Sure, I can go if I'm Dan Burwood. I'm at Integrity Action, which is a very small UK-based NGO focusing on social accountability and sort of citizen-led monitoring of initiatives in primarily or solely at the moment Africa and Asia. I think we're in around about 10 countries at the moment. So my role, which I've been in for a year and a half or so, is evidence and impact manager. Before that, I mean, I've been in sort of the development context, as it were, for about 10 years. Yeah, something like that. About 6 of those, I think, have been on this kind of side of things around monitoring, evaluation, and learning. So lots of obviously data collection that kind of goes along with that in terms of yeah, you know, outputs, outcomes and impact of programs and participants' knowledge, attitude and practice, that kind of thing. I guess currently I'm more involved, as Florian is, in kind of creating and analysing surveys rather than conducting. And when I do travel around, which obviously hasn't been much at all this year, but kind of I tend to kind of be more in, yeah, I kind of tend to do more kind of the either qualitative or free form, kind of, you know, semi-structured interviews, focus groups, participation methods, that kind of thing, rather than necessarily these sorts of surveys. But yeah, definitely do lots of surveys like this. They're very interesting.
That's great. Thank you so much. Okay, I think, yes, Sabrina, please go ahead.
Yeah, I'll bring it home. I'm Sabrina. I work at the Duke Global Health Institute. So I think I'm sort of an odd person out here at this conference in the sense that I'm university affiliated. But really my role as a data architect at the Global Health Institute aligns more closely with what people are doing in the humanitarian aid sector than it does with a lot of university-based research. So that's why I'm here. As a data architect, my job is sort of to align every part of data collection and management, starting from when we're writing grants to propose projects to close out whenever we're thinking about sharing data through a data repository or some other mechanism. And being sure that all of the technical pieces, all of the workflows, all of the operations our study teams are doing on the ground overseas are all working together in a coherent, streamlined way. So part of my job is often survey design, not only helping teams think through how to frame questions, but also choosing the right mode of delivering the instruments. And then on the back end, merging together data that was collected, sometimes with multiple different instruments. Because we're a global health institute, we do studies all around the world. Right now I'm supporting a study on mental health in Nepal. So we often have instruments written first in English, and then they're translated into other languages. So I was really curious to join this session and just hear about some of the common paradigms for thinking through implications of language and culture on how we can maximize the effectiveness of our instrument creation.
That's great. Thank you so much, everyone. A really wide array of experiences. I would love to hear from you all. So what we have on the agenda for this breakout, or well, this next section of the presentation altogether, is I have a warm-up exercise for you all to just kind of discuss survey question improvement, which is number 2 here. And so I'm offering, you know, my own survey question that is not the best question that I've ever come up with. And so I'd love to hear from you about how, you know, how have you approached it? If you have, you know, done surveys before, or what would you improve about this kind of survey question? And then, you know, coming from your own backgrounds and your own, the cultures that you work with and the languages that you work with, how would you approach it differently in various contexts? So, you know, the question that I'm offering here is the question that we asked that we saw in the presentation. How would you describe your life in the US so far, good, average, or bad? So if you have any, you know, improvements, you know, what's not great about this question, you know, what's good about the question, you know, any thoughts that you have about this question and how you might improve it in your surveys.
Hi, maybe I would, can we answer? Yeah, okay, great.
Yes, please.
Just one small thing I would say, but it's from my personal experience. The expression so far is really, well, I really think it's American, and I learned it when I went there. So before learning English, I didn't know what so far meant. So maybe just reformulate this part.
That's a really good point. And I had not thought of that. That's a really great point. Yeah. Okay. Any other thoughts? How about the 3-point scale? Good, average, or bad? How do you typically approach scaled questions? Do you use 3 points? Do you use 5 points? Use a scale of 1 to 10? Like we saw all of the different ways of doing a scale. How do you understand this question? Good, average, or bad? Your life in the US.
Maybe it is a bit limiting.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah, and you don't have the option to answer, I don't want to answer.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, good points, yes.
Yeah, I think 3-point scales can work and they've got a place, but that's a very broad question, which might be fine. Like, I mean, that's probably something I'd have looked at before, but sometimes you want to ask broad questions like that as maybe a summary or an overall, either at the start or the end. But if you're asking something that broad, I think you need a broad range of
yeah, exactly.
And
yeah.
Kind of, sorry, there's kind of not a sense of like a comparator, like good, average, or bad compared to what. I mean, in this context, for example,
right.
if they're refugees, maybe anything might appear better than the previous situation, but it doesn't.
Yeah.
Like maybe it's good compared to their expectations rather than that kind of thing.
Yeah, exactly. I think the midpoint here, the average, like you said, compared to what is the average that we're looking at, and for them that might be something very, very different, or they might not know how other refugees are faring. They only know how they themselves are faring with their life. So yeah, any other thoughts on this before we move on to the next point?
Here we don't have any context about the question, but the thing that I would ask is, what do you want to, what kind of information are you seeking with this question? Are you asking about the quality of life? Are you trying to measure an improvement between the time where people arrived and the current situation? So we don't really know, but if I had to improve the question, I would first try to understand what is the objective of this question, and then maybe try to reformulate it.
Yeah, exactly. It's a great point.
It seems pretty clear from context that the question is eliciting feedback about their subjective opinions of what their life has been like, but it might help even to make that more explicit by framing it as, how would you describe your feelings or your satisfaction with your life in the US so far? And this ties a little bit into that discussion we've had about that word average, because I can see how someone taking the survey and encountering this question might interpret it as, I'm being asked to like evaluate my experience in the US using some sort of objective frame of reference. Right. And I don't know what that objective standard is supposed to be, so I don't know how to answer.
Yeah, I think in this case, a question so broad like this would likely be better served either as an open-ended question, like we saw that response who decided to answer it as an open-ended question because they didn't like this 3-point scale to describe, such a broad question. So it might be better served breaking it down, into more specific, like Florian said, what exactly is our objective here? What exactly are we measuring? So yeah, really great feedback on that. So let's move on. Yelena, do you know how much time we have left in the session?
We have, let me check, 20 minutes left.
Okay, great. So in this next section, I wanted you all to kind of come up with your own survey questions to, obviously everyone comes from pretty different backgrounds, but if you can come up with some survey goals that you might have in common, and then come up with some questions that you may want to ask. And of course, draw from your own experiences. What have you tried? What would you like to try? And then focusing on the SMS format. So how might you approach this if it was on SMS as opposed to telephone or in person, which can be longer questions. SMS is very brief. So how would you come up with some questions? So we do have room on the bottom. So we did have the 2 groups, but now we just have the 1. So if you all want to discuss amongst yourselves, what do you think is a common question that maybe you can agree upon to ask? And then how would you ask it in an SMS context? And what are the considerations that you would take into account? either from your own experiences, or if you're new to surveying, what might you think about in that context? So the first is the survey goal. Tell me a little bit about the goals of some of the surveys that you have conducted, and how did you decide upon them? Or again, if you're new to surveying, what might be a goal of a survey you want to discuss or that you want to conduct?
I have one example. Let the others say if that works for them, but something that we are doing a lot these days is obviously having a survey about the impact of the COVID-19 crisis.
That's great.
So maybe the kind of survey that we are looking at would be something to determine whether how the crisis affected the access to services for people that we are talking to.
Okay. So okay, yeah, that's great. I'm sure everyone is very much affected by COVID-19 across the world, and it has definitely impacted services. So the goal of the survey, if anyone has any other goals that they have in mind, please feel free. And you can, I believe you all have edit access here as well. So you can take notes, add to this as much as you would like. Okay. So as part of the goal of our survey design, it's important to think about how we want to disaggregate the data in the end. So do you think that there might be disproportionate impacts on different subpopulations with access to services in your contexts?
I mean, we wouldn't know without asking. So yeah, I mean, we would always include disaggregation by at least kind of gender, age, and some form of disability.
Okay.
But that, there may well be, there's a lot more you can add to that list. That's kind of just what we'd kind of use as default.
Yeah, I would say in our context here with refugee services, we see different impacts, whether it's a family with two parents or whether it's maybe a single parent household. So I would be interested how you would approach that as well. Obviously, we can have gender. Are there ways that you might approach, how many parents there are if it's a single parent versus two-parent household, for example?
I mean, yeah, it depends entirely on kind of the context and the kind of the audience. So a lot of the people we're surveying, I suppose we've kind of got two main surveys that are kind of, we'll do kind of contextual ones as well, but one group that we survey are people that are already involved in our work anyway, so we can ask them a bit more potentially sensitive information. Disability, in that case, we would ask them the Washington group short set in order to kind of get a bit more accurate and kind of nuanced information, for example. So we could, if it was relevant to what we were asking them, we could include things about their household and family like that. And other surveys that we might ask, actually, that it's not us that ask it, we'd kind of create the surveys, but then they're asked by actually the people who are responding to that first batch of surveys. So then they're asking their peers and so on. And in that context, the people that are asking, have less less connection to us, so it's maybe not as appropriate. And also the people doing the surveying in our particular context aren't really trained in social research methods or kind of even how to do. I mean, we provide some training, but they're not professional. So again, just an example, in disability in that case, we would kind of use a more self-identified yes/no question, and yeah, we probably wouldn't be putting in that kind of household information, but that's for that. That's for that context. Within a specific evaluation, we may well want to look into that because, as you say, it's a risk factor.
Right, so we have the goal of the survey is to determine how access to services have been impacted by COVID-19. So what are the kinds of questions that you would want to ask about that? Would you be asking a yes and no, have your services been impacted, yes or no? Or are there different ways that you might break that down?
Maybe we can ask them if the service have closed or if they are still working. And another question could be about how do they feel about going to this service, or if they just don't want to go even if they're open, like more how do they feel about it?
So kind of like, how do they feel about the risk of going?
Yeah, related to COVID, of course.
Okay.
We'd want to assess a baseline. So asking, I'd probably give them a multiple choice list of preset choices and say, which of these services were you using 6 months before? How are we define the date? We could define the date as the start of pandemic impact in their context where we are locally.
Okay.
Have them check all that apply. And then ask a follow-up question. Has your access to any of these services been interrupted? If yes, select which ones. And give them the same choice list. For which of these services has your access been interrupted?
Okay. Yeah, so in SMS, in the Text It, I don't know if anyone has ever used Text It before or a similar program online, but they do have that great feature. I think it's called piping. I believe they have piping where you could do something like that, where you have the options, and if they respond in a particular manner, it would take that response and add it to the next question. It might be difficult though with multiple choice. So I'm not sure if that kind of piping effect would function via SMS. But curious if anyone else has used something like that, or how they might envision, taking that question set that Sabrina mentioned and making it accessible via SMS. So how would you do that? So remember that your characters are limited in SMS. The format might get messed up depending on the carrier, depending on the type of phone. So how would you be asking those questions?
I guess for the multiple choice question, the list should be at the end, like right after the question, and be like 1, I don't know, post office, 2, hospital, 3, blah, blah, blah. And then the respondent would only respond 1, 2, 3, or 1 and 2, or but it should be precise where, like if they need to have a comma in between, or if they just need a space in between. But I guess it's difficult with limited characters.
Yeah, exactly. And so in my experience, and again, I've used Text It and a company called Twilio. And with both of those, it's not able to recognize multiple responses at the same time. So if we had asked, check or select all that are relevant, if they said, hospital, comma, emergency room, it would only recognize the first in that series. So I'm not sure, at least using TextIt, I don't know if that would work. Of course, you could analyze your responses, manually using the data export, but the coding would not recognize it. Yeah.
So maybe in this case, we need to ask ourselves whether we really need to have this list of services.
Okay.
Maybe we just want to focus on one specific, or if we absolutely need the list, then I guess we need to have several questions. So instead of having which services do you use, we would have to go, did you use this service? Then did you use this one and this one? But that would make a lot of questions.
Yeah.
I don't see any other option if we don't have multiple answers.
Yeah, in one way, depending on the type of service that you're providing, you may have an administrative list. If you have a list of participants, that they have gone to your service, whatever services they've accessed. So you may be able to rely on that. But if it's more general, services maybe that you do not have control over, but you're interested in learning about, yeah, you might need to ask one by one in an SMS context. Yeah. Okay, so I'm curious about, so the first question that we had received, I think Colleen, you had mentioned, how do they feel about going to access the service now? So what is their feeling about the risk? So, thinking about the different types of scales, the different numbers of scale points that you might be using, how would you approach this? What would the responses look like? Would it be, very scared or very uncomfortable? What kinds of words would you use to get that information?
I'm not sure it's the right answer, but I would use I would actually formulate sentences, but be the most neutral as possible. Like really various scenarios, like I feel comfortable, but I feel like I don't need to go because some other people might be more like in need than me, or like I'm like, yeah, really maybe have multiple scenarios and formulate. But I don't know if that's...
Yeah. And for those of you who work in different countries and different languages, do you have any thoughts about, the types of words or, the types of the comfort in expressing this kind of emotion about this comfort level risk assessment? Have you experienced in your own work, risk assessments via surveys and how they respond to that?
The only thing I can think of is, so in terms of language, we'd always use a local language. Yeah, the only thing around safety, I mean, I think people would be kind of okay, they'd understand and probably be okay kind of reporting if they felt unsafe, if it was to do with something kind of not a personal thing, so a disease or kind of a risk that's not personal. They may well be less willing to kind of report something if they thought it was the behaviour of someone that was making them unsafe. So if it was to do with at this health clinic, actually none of the doctors are washing their hands, that kind of thing. And that makes them feel uncomfortable. They might be more reluctant to kind of to say that. But if it was a case of, well, COVID generally, that's quite a scary thing. Yes, it's a bit scary.
Yeah. Thank you.
I think if we were administering the survey to a non-English speaking population, I would rely really heavily on the translator who was fluent in the local language to know the connotations of, like, for example, safe versus risk versus danger, because all of those words might have different connotations in English.
Yeah.
If we pose this question to an English speaking audience. So I think it really, this is another scenario where we have to really think about what we want to elicit. Do we want to elicit from the respondent a guess at, like, what they think their risk scenario is, or do we want to elicit more a subjective feeling, like do they feel safe? Do they feel endangered? What's their emotional and mental state like?
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you. Okay, so I think we only have a few minutes left. So we can go ahead and wrap it up. Just going to switch back here. So you know, we all work together, obviously, so we don't need to report out to each other. But I'd love to take the last couple minutes for anyone to speak up about, you know, any of your experiences that you would like to share that might be helpful for the rest of us working with different populations, different languages. If you have any experiences from your own work that you can share, that would be great. Otherwise, if you have any questions for me, again, I did drop a file into the chat. It's a PDF of some resources that you are free to take a look at, some research that I've found on different response behaviors and things like that. So any questions, or anyone want to share anything?
And I'm sure there's a few things I could share, but just, yeah, particularly on the last point that Sabrina, I think, mentioned about translation, and there's a good quote. I think that, you know, definitely that translators and interpreters need to be bicultural as well as bilingual, definitely, because otherwise a lot can be lost in translation, as we know, whether that's kind of idioms or, you know, nuance or all sorts. So yeah, definitely, and actually professional translators or interpreters aren't always going to be as good for that as actually maybe you've got someone, a contact within the community or a local kind of, you know, grassroots organization or something. Maybe their grammar's not perfect, but they understand the program, and they can communicate with kind of the population that are being surveyed, and they can roughly translate that into English, or they can translate it well into English. I would always prefer that kind of latter. Obviously, it's great if you can kind of find someone who does both, but yeah, kind of translating and bridging the cultures, probably more important than translating and bridging the kind of the perfect language. Yeah,
on the resource list, you may be interested. There was a study that was conducted, I believe it was in Kenya, regarding whether the survey was translated from, let's say, Swahili, whether it was translated into a more minor language by the survey enumerator, the person who was there, or whether it was actually translated into that language. So whether it was kind of on the fly interpretation, or if it was actually reading off of a standardized translation. And so they found some interesting results as to, you know, did that affect the survey responses that they got. So you may be interested in taking a look at that on the list. Okay, well, I do believe that is time. Let's see. Yes, I think that is time. This is my contact information, and Lauren, who's also on the call with me, that's her contact information. If you have any questions, or if you want to chat, you know, anything about survey methodology, I love survey methodology. So I would love to hear from you. If you have resources to share, I would love to see them. And thank you so much for joining me today. I hope this was helpful.
Yeah, thanks, Rachel.
Bye.
Thank you very much. It was interesting.
Thanks, Queen.
Thank you.
Bye.